industry. Okay, and now I'm going to resume my slideshow. And then the other thing I want to talk about is a little bit about native cultivars, which I know you've probably seen a fair bit, and then some stuff about how I think climate change is going to affect the industry. And I'm going to give a quick apology here at the beginning, or I'm going not even apologize, but I do tend to use Latin names. It avoids a lot of confusion. I did have to learn it in 3 different languages when I first started. I learned it in French and Italian and English, and the Latin was the same as the French and the Italian. So the English is the last name that comes to me. Latin pronunciation, you're pretty much supposed to pronounce all the letters. I'm extremely dyslexic, so I usually get it right, but not always. I figure really correcting people's pronunciation is a little bit, you know, you don't really need to do that. If you think I've really got it wrong, by all means, let me know in an email and I will sort it out. I certainly get things quite wrong, often, really. So I wanted to talk a little bit about obvious things that can affect the perennials. And so there's a couple that are very, very obvious right away. Is it a dry location or a wet location? Is it a shady location or a sun location? And those are the questions we really we try and ask people when they come to the nursery looking for a plant. And there's some subtleties to that. And some people don't know what we mean by shade, and really we mean shade in the afternoon is shade, and shade in the morning is probably part shade. And sun is sun all day. Dry and wet should be pretty much self-explanatory. And the picture there is a bunch of little primulas, and I showed them partly because I want to talk about coolness, and primulas are a classic example of a perennial that, while they like it moist, they more than that want it to be cool. And sometimes that can be a little hard to achieve. Some of the less obvious factors are the hot and the cool. As we have climate change happening, we are seeing more heat type events. Wind. So a lot of people don't realize that in a particularly windy spot, some perennials are not going to be as able to cope with that. The wind creates both drought and windburn on the plants. Sometimes people come to me and I always think it's a great challenge, but they might have a very boggy yard. I had somebody who came to me in the middle of the drought in August. She said, when I knelt down in my backyard, my knees got wet. Now what? So I thought it was great, but she wasn't too impressed. But anyway, she'll figure it out. And then evergreen. So we don't think of perennials as being evergreens, but some of them certainly are. I've got a picture here of a hellebore foliage that I took today, and that green foliage will show all winter. And so that in our design needs to be something that we think about. But also then when we do have evergreen foliage, we want to be careful to try and collect the snow in those areas over the winter to help prevent some windburn. And the hellebores will die down by the end of winter, and then we just clip them back and away they come. And so the other thing that can affect gardens quite a bit is trees or hedges or buildings. The trees dry things out. A lot of people don't realize how much moisture the trees suck out of the water, out of the ground. Hedges for sure can affect wind swept-ness. They can make a great shade, but they can also just change things. Sometimes they might funnel the wind in a certain direction. So certainly everybody knows in winter there's a spot on your property that gets very windswept. You never have to shovel. Probably not the greatest location for a perennial garden. So here's a couple of other evergreen perennials just while we're on the subject. And I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little scattered. I asked not to talk in October because I tend to be fairly busy, but you guys really needed somebody. So I put this together, but it's a little all over the place, but more evergreen. So those are Bergenia. There's a hellebore flower. and Pachysandra. It's another really nice. These are evergreens. The Pachysandra is a great ground cover. And the common name for Pachysandra is spurge, and hellebores are Lenten roses. And Virginias, which we all probably just call Virginias, have pig squeak, which is a very inelegant common name. And another one, but I thought that was, I don't know about that one. Other factors. So I'm going to call it reluctance to water properly. And some of it is that we don't know. And some of it is that for some people, we simply can't. One of the most common ones that I see is people who water in the evening, which is not really very good for your plants. Usually they don't water enough. Some people water too much, but they might also have a well, and then you can't water for hours and hours and hours, or watering restrictions. But we do try and teach people that there's a difference between watering a garden all the time and establishing new plants. And so that when you do have new plants, they are used to being watered quite frequently, and you kind of need to wean them back from that. And I do know I have customers who just put everything in, and if it dies, it dies. But that seems like a sort of a shotgun approach. A lot of people have deer. And these days, rabbit. We're hearing about rabbits almost more than deer, as well as dogs and cats and kids. For the deer and rabbit, we do find, for the most part, that they like, the deer and rabbit like the same plants. So we designate on our signage whether things are deer resistant. That said, if you've got hungry deer that have a regular path through your property, they're going to eat stuff along that path. And the best solution is to just plant stuff they don't like along that path. Winter salt can highly affect our gardens, especially out by the road, or if somebody shovels the salty driveway onto the garden in an area, that can be quite difficult to deal with. The effect of hot summer wind over pavement, we see it more in the trees. If you look in a hot summer at the trees around a big parking lot like a shopping center, you're going to see a lot of leaf scorch on the edges, and that is very damaging to the trees, of course, but it's also damaging to any gardens that are seeing that hot. So any pavement to the southwest of them that's creating the heat, and then they're getting it wind over, can create quite a bit of more drought than it would normally have. And then, as I talked about before, the winter winds are not great. So ferns, I'm going to just get a water there. So ferns, of course, we always think of them as liking cool, moist shade, and they do. And if it's too hot, you will definitely see more burnout. Some of the ferns, like the Japanese painted ferns, are a little more drought tolerant and a little more sun tolerant. But they're a great plant to choose for, especially for building shade, or an area that's boggy. They don't do as well with tree shade, although they'll do just fine. They'll go dormant, unfortunately, but the tree shade, again, we're back to the issue of the trees sucking up the water. This is a picture of big aconitum. This variety it's like a climber, but it is actually just a perennial. It's not a vine. It just sort of leans on this trellis. And it is actually quite drought tolerant, but again, once it's established. So that's back to that question of establishing plants versus watering them all the time. But this is in a location where we might water it twice a summer. If it's been really dry, we think, oh, we should really give that a bit of shot of water, but it seems to be just fine. The tree sucks up a lot of moisture. There's hosta in there. It's another really drought tolerant, once established plant is hosta. The Solomon seal, very drought tolerant once established. And this is me sort of jumping all over the place. So there's two clematis here. I do find actually clematis, once they're established they are very drought tolerant, and the easiest way for us to kill them is to overwater them in the pots. So these are two examples of species type clematis. The blue one is it's Clematis alpina. It's Pamela Jackmani. Pamela Jackmani, yes. And it has beautiful little flower heads. It's in a very shaded location, but it can grow and thrive there partly because of the white wall, and partly because although it's shaded, it's fairly open. It's on the north side of the building. And then the other little clematis is a Tangutica Golden Harvest, which we stuck in a barrel with the cedar tree, and then it's doing absolutely beautifully in there, and has overwintered in the, it's like a horse trough. So anything that can overwinter in a big, that is an enormous pot, 150-gallon pot, but anything that can overwinter in an upright pot is it's a pretty good sign that it's quite hardy. So this is an absolutely gorgeous little clematis. And then, and these are just some pictures of pinks. They're just classic pinks. This is Fire Witch and this is Fire Star. And we've found that the people are also telling us, but I found this when I was landscaping, the pinks, although you think of them as a nice, hot, sunny plant, they don't actually thrive all that well in the hot sun. So a little bit of shade. They don't do as well as like a sedum ground cover or the moss phlox in the hot sun. They tend to get a little burned out, but if you let them go to seed, they will reward you for decades. And then we get into some hot and dry stuff. And certainly some of the hot perennials will actually not thrive at all if you get them too wet. And I've got a picture here of the poppy. That one's Perry's White. And we get a lot of questions about poppies. They're a funny plant. They're hard to establish in pots and hard to kill in your garden. Because they have a taproot, they don't divide well, and they actually really resent any disturbance of the roots, especially the first couple of years, to the point where we have found that if we weed them in the pots, they're unhappy. So if you ever come late in the season to get a poppy from us, you'll find it's full of dandelions. But as long as you pull those out and plant it, it's fine. But they will go completely dormant later in the season, and then you get a little bit of growth on them in the fall, and that's perfectly normal for poppies. They really don't like having anything planted that covers that foliage area. But a really good mix is the Perovskia, the Russian sage, because it's like a shrub. It sort of comes up and then it doesn't actually cover the poppies. They go together very well. And then even the drought lovers will need some water when it's, when it goes more than 10 days without raining is probably a good rule of thumb. And the killer is the hot winds. So we get that hot south wind for day after day, and then that's when you see them really struggling. But you don't want to water too often because you really want the roots to go down fairly deeply. And into this category of plants that go dormant after flowering would fall all the bulbs. So the tulips and the daffodils, and also your little lawn bulbs, your crocus and stuff. They're mostly native to the area around Turkey and Greece is where they would come from originally. That's where tulips originated. And so those areas get a very hot, dry summer and a reasonably moist winter. But although they're not perennials, we sort of count them in there. And then sedum, we kind of went crazy for sedum. People really like them for a lot of reasons. They're kind of cast iron little plants, and we use them extensively in our hot gardens. This is a low sedum on the left with the pretty yellow flower, and then the fall sedums are great. They attract huge numbers of pollinators. It's not unusual to see this plant just covered in bees through the fall. And as long as you don't overwater them, they're okay. There's another one that really presents overwater, which can be a very useful thing. Irises. So the hot irises. So one of those pictures is of the bulb form of iris called Iris reticulata or Iris reticula. They are planted the same time you plant tulips or crocuses, and they are very early, very sweet, the little purple ones, so they're the first. And again, a very drought tolerant plant. And then we also have the other little irises, and they're the bearded type irises that are very drought tolerant. The Siberian irises are not as drought tolerant, and then you get the Japanese Ansatas, and they're actually better off in the pond. So the iris is a broad family. And this is a picture of one of my snowdrops, Oenothera, another really lovely hot growing plant with a dwarf iris beside it. And these are, so more iris in the background here. You can see with the Nepeta in front. So this is a garden that most of you who've been to the nursery would know is our hot garden. That said, you know, it does get watered quite regularly because we water everything around here. But it definitely we've made it up to be plants that really thrive in the heat. You can see the moss phlox, which took over that garden since this picture was taken, but I did try and weed a bunch of it out. And then in the foreground here, this beautiful little blue creeping Veronica. And Baptisia australis, the false indigo, which is also actually native a little further south than this, but it's a beautiful plant. And then the Russian sage, the Perovskia, which have had a really wonderful summer. We're seeing some really, really great examples of Perovskia that are just blooming for a long, long time. And it's technically like lavender. It's not technically a perennial, it's a shrub, but we can treat it like a perennial. As long as we don't cut it back in the fall, the Perovskia will come back year after year after year. And like situations, for instance, like a hot driveway, or it's quite a heat tolerant plant. Echinacea, of course, with the Amsonia, the blue star behind it. Another echinaceas are great for drought gardens. And I just wanted to show you guys a picture of the cactus. That's the Opuntia humifusa. That's a prickly pear. And while they're no longer really native in this area, they can grow quite well here. And people have big patches of them in their gardens. And then you just weed them with needle nose pliers, because they really get you when they get you. And people with big established patches of them tell me they flower every year for them. We mostly just keep them in pots because we can't. I don't want to weed them. Really, that's what it comes down to. And there's a Helenium, picture of a Helenium. So that's Moerheim beauty in the fall for some fall flower. And then the Itoh Peonies. So the Itoh Peonies have become crazy popular in the last few years. Admittedly, like, 20. But anyways, one of the real great things about them is they don't need staking. The flowers are huge. They die back to the ground, so they're quite hardy, quite a bit hardier than the tree peony, which can be a bit iffy. I know my tree peony on a windy, cold winter will sometimes die back a fair bit. So I wanted to talk about plant patents because I think, well, some of us sort of understand that they exist. You may not understand how much they drive the industry. And so when I go to buy the plants that I then grow and sell here, I pay a royalty on probably about 2/3 of the plants that I sell through here. I would pay a small royalty, and it seems like a small amount. I'm paying 20 cents a plant, but 10,000 plants later, it's a fairly substantial cost. And this money goes to the big companies that are developing new cultivars. But what that means on the negative side is that there's less tendency to keep up the old varieties. There always seem to be going for more and more. The big thing, of course, they want with perennials is for them to flower for longer. So they want that perennial that can flower all year. And then they also do things like, for instance, if I buy a proven winner, more in a shrub than a perennial usually, but there are some proven winner perennials I have to buy. I need to buy the pots. I cannot buy the plants without buying the pots. They're not pots that fit into my watering scheme, but by law, I can't display any other plants in those proven winner pots. And I should technically eventually sell them in their proven winner pots. I'm allowed to grow them in a pot and then put them in the proven winner pot. But, and so those pots might cost 3 or 4 times as much as the normal pots. Plant patents basically developed so that people couldn't just go in there and, like we all do, just divide the perennials up and then sell them, because somebody's put a lot of work into creating these things. And so all plant patents are on asexual reproduce. So they have selected or bred a plant that can't be grown from seed. And so what you're not allowed to do, technically, you're not allowed to divide them or take cuttings from them. So while you in your gardens, it doesn't matter if you take a proven winner or a patented plant and cut it up and have, that's not what they're after. They're after, they don't want me to be able to cut it up and sell it individually. And so that drives the industry, because although these tend to be exceptional plants, the other side of it is that nobody wants to develop, for example, native plants because they can't patent them. So it's back to sort of one of the, I don't know if I want to call it a problem with the industry, but something that happens within the industry. And you'll see it happening through shrubs, not so much trees, although some trees are definitely patented. So I've used Veronica royal candles as an example. It's one of the perennials that we get them here. They start to bloom. Boy, by June, they're pretty much blooming and they're still in bloom. So great, long time flowering. But they're probably one of the higher royalties I pay. It's not a lot. It's maybe 27 or 35 cents a plant, but you know, it adds up. And then I'm going to move into native perennials, and it sort of ties together, because one of the problems is that it isn't worth it within the industry to promote native plants, essentially. So nobody's taking out ads to promote this beautiful, I hope you can all see it, this beautiful Rudbeckia trilobum, but they can promote the nativar, the prairie glow. And certainly I'm seeing pushback where a lot of people that are putting in native gardens, which I applaud, it's a great idea, won't take the so-called nativars, and then some of them just will madly go off and call it native, even if it's, you know, grown in North America. So I think that the answer is kind of do your research there before you declare something a native, but also be willing to look at the nativars for because they do have pronounced vigor and they do have beautiful flowers. So some truly native plants. So I had it in the slide, but basically a native plant will never have a third name because they haven't been selected at all. So these are some of the ones that I'm sure you know or not. The anemone canadensis is that Canadian anemone that grows in the woods. We've got a lot around the sign here. It's incredibly invasive, which can be a useful thing. Jack in the pulpits, the wild ginger. So the Cicerum canadensis, which I don't actually get from my suppliers, although I have ordered it every year for the last 10 years. I have never actually received it, but I know lots of people have it and somebody's going to finally give me some. Baptisia australis, again, its range is more south, but they're calling it native. The bunchberry, beautiful plant. I don't know how it got in the corner stand really. Echinacea purpurea. So we tend to lump all the echinacea, the purple cone flowers, but really it's only purpurea. Well, I never see that available on my list, but it would grow easily from seed. Many ferns are native to this area. Certainly the ostrich fern, the cinnamon fern are all native, the male ferns. And then wintergreen, native. I've got a little slide about it. Bowman's root, beautiful, absolutely beautiful perennial that I actually forget the Galenia is native. And that's one of the things around here. We just grow perennials. We forget about the fact that they're native, but they are. Jerusalem artichoke, highly invasive. But if you've got some space, it's a great plant to grow. The songbirds absolutely adore the seeds from it. I would be cautious about growing it. That said, I have a very large patch, but perhaps a little larger than I meant to. Virginia bluebells, bloodroot, some of the trilliums, not all of them, but some of them are native, and they can be cultivated in they're commercially. So as long as they're commercially cultivated, that's okay to have them. And the Veronicas and the Culver's root that you see here, it's a nice plant. And there's a picture of the wintergreen. We've had some success. People have had some success growing it. It's very pretty. The berries are nice. The leaves taste like wintergreen. The berries taste like wintergreen. But it can sunburn a little bit. So the wintering is still a bit of a problem. And it may actually be one of those perennials that is finding the summers too warm in our area. And so here's some other nice perennials. There's that Galenia, the Bowman's root, which is native. And then this is a thalictrum, or a meadow root. And the other one over here is a foam flower, although this is not the native foam flower. It's got beautiful leaves on it, but they're a great filler for shady areas. And I'm kind of speeding through things here, but anyways, I just wanted to put in a little plug for the bulbs. We carry a very large selection. We keep it to like single colors. We don't have as much sort of mixed tulips, but we have single colors of stuff. We have a lot of narcissus and daffodils. Right now we're almost out of tulips, but we still have lots of the allium, both the small varieties and the bigger ones. Lots of lawn bulbs. If you come by in the spring, you're going to see we plant a lot here and have over the last 30 years that I've lived on this property. So we have a pretty spectacular daffodil display, and a lot of our lawns are full of lawn bulbs, Scilla and crocus and stuff. We also carry, and I actually, because of the Ganhort societies, started carrying Amaryllis, and we get a top size bulb in there, absolutely fabulous. And so we have 7 different colors of those, and Also the paper whites for Christmas decorations. And this year there's a new to us variety of paper white that's unscented, which is kind of fun. And click. Website. We have an extensive website. We have since the beginning of COVID, we have been posting our availability. It's a PDF and it just shows a list of what we have and how much they are. And people use that all winter for their planning. I'll get it up. I post the PDF sometimes a little bit before we actually get the material, which is a bit nail biting. And especially when we're having pretty serious issues within the industry about supply. So we're only getting 2/3 of what we order. And on the website, there's photo catalogs. We announce the sales. I only announce sales in the news or in the newsletter, or it goes on with Facebook and Instagram. We don't do any other advertising. And we talk about the workshops. And I think that's pretty much it. You probably know us already, but we're 8 kilometers out of Gananoque. And if anybody had any questions, it would be a good time now to ask.